very pleased to announce that we have Mike Gonzalez, who's a long-standing member of the SWP in Britain, who's travelled over today to speak for us. I said he's a long-standing member of the SWP. I'm sure plenty of people are probably familiar with the name Mike Gonzalez. He's wrote numerous books, which I won't try and name them all off, particularly around politics of Latin America. So without further ado, I'm going to let Mike talk for the next 30 minutes. Thank you.
Right, comrades. Oh. I thought I had to earn that. But anyway, I want to start with Gaza. Which may not immediately seem apparent as to why I wanted to speak about Gaza in a meeting about the politics of water. Today, just before I came up, like everybody else, I'm on the television screen at the bombs dropping on Gaza, the injuries, which according to Shimon Peres are mere fiction. Nobody's been hurt, nobody's been injured, nobody's been killed, and so the bodies we've seen are, I don't know, illusions. But we know about those weapons lobbed endlessly over the border from Gaza and so on. We know about the weapons that have been sent against the Palestinian population. What we may not know is that while those weapons are familiar to us, for many years now, the Israeli state has been using another weapon against the Palestinian people. In many ways, a more effective weapon, and certainly a more long-standing weapon, and that weapon is thirst. The River Jordan is less than 100 miles long. The 67 war, a war apparently of frontiers, was in many ways a war to conquer and control water, to control the headwaters of the Jordan, which are, of course, in the Golan Heights, and to divert the water of the River Jordan so that Gaza and the West Bank would be left thirsty. The water that is available to them is delivered to them in tankers by the Israeli Water Authority, and the control of the River Jordan was a strategic decision, a decision made many, many years ago. In a letter from Chaim Weizmann to Lloyd George in 1918, Weizmann said the future of Israel will be dependent upon water and electricity, the two, of course, interwoven. So the manipulation of thirst, among the many vicious cruelties of which we know the Israeli state to have been guilty, which causes them, as we also know, no qualms of conscience whatsoever. The manipulation of thirst is a particularly cruel one. But it isn't simply characteristic of the Israeli state. The manipulation of thirst, the control of water, has been a weapon used for many years by capitalism itself, but in the last 20 or 30 years has become a much more central issue than ever it was. And Gaza is just one example. I mean, it was in the, I think it was about 1999, a vice president, whose name I've forgotten, a vice president of the World Bank, delivered himself of a very famous phrase. He said, if the 20th century, the wars of the 20th century have been about oil, the wars of the 21st century will be about water. A neat little phrase. But it's worth just for a moment thinking about the significance of that. Whatever we might think of oil and the energy companies and markets for the control of oil as a worldwide commodity, part of the bigger picture of the struggle between increasingly large capitalist enterprises over the control of all sorts of commodities. When we speak about water, we should stop to think that water is not just another commodity. Water is life. If they can't control the air, I remember somebody saying to me once, it's only because they haven't found a way of metering it yet, right? But the case of water is something else. In a sense, it illustrates in the most powerful and dramatic way the fundamental cruelty and barbarism of capitalism as a system. I want to illustrate that by the fact that I think probably the last 30 years have seen a much wider and more widespread and more persistent debate about water. Perhaps as the world's populations have grown, as debates about global warming and the environment have begun to extend and expand across the planet, so debates about water have also become more and more prominent. In the UN, for example, expressed very little interest in water when Israel seized control of the Jordan. There was little said about water. In the intervening period, when slowly and gently water resources began to be brought under control, great dams were built, which by and large were monuments to state power, and almost invariably monstrously expensive, and almost invariably built by firms whose names we now are very familiar with, but weren't necessarily familiar with them in the beginning. Names like, for example, Halliburton, you know, a universal engineering company which is responsible for many of the world's great dams. What we learned less about, as the Aswan Dam and the Hoover Dam and all the others were open to the delight and the amazement of a population, a world population celebrating modernity and the control of water. What we'd heard less about were the 80 million or so people displaced by those dams, a process which continues now as we speak. There's a battle over a huge dam complex on the Xingu River in Brazil, which will bring about the immediate displacement of 100,000 families and the long-term displacement of many, many more people. Now, I'll come back to this in a minute. Perhaps we might imagine that water is somehow outside the normal conduct of world trade in an increasingly ruthless capitalist system. It isn't. It is a commodity now. In the 1980s, as we come further towards the present day, the one consistent factor you'll notice in debates and discussions about water, water provision, access for the majority of the world's population to fresh water, sanitation, and so on, is that every decision is systematically ignored. And part of the reason why it's ignored may be found in the fact that in the early 1990s, the World Trade Organization formed and set out a series of regulations which still govern world trade, and which make it quite clear that resources like water must be seen and addressed as commodities in a world trade cycle and cannot be restricted. This is a very dramatic thing when you think about minerals and lithium and tin and gas and oil. It's obvious and we can make our protest. But it also extends to water. And part of the reason for the inaction as a result of the Brunson report and the many other reports that followed is that it was considered one more commodity whose restriction would be a restraint of trade in the conditions of the global market of the 1990s and the beginnings of the 21st century. Evidence of that, it sounds fanciful, I know. Recently, the California, you may know, is an extremely rich area of the world. It's also a very dry area of the world, and we can consider later at some point what on earth possessed them to build massive modern cities in the middle of a desert. However, they did. And California is constantly, it's mostly trying to seize everything. It tried to seize Bolivian gas, and then it tried to seize the water of one of the water richest countries in the world, which is Canada. After Brazil comes Canada. And they applied to the government of British Columbia to buy water from Canada. The British Columbian government, in a kind of seizure, a moment of social concern, decided that they weren't going to sell the water to California, and that Los Angeles would have to go manage with less water. The Californian government then immediately sued the British Columbian government for restraint of trade. A similar example, and in some senses, and it's very significant, a better known one perhaps, is of course the example of Cochabamba. And really when we talk about water and we talk about the struggle over control of water, the key crossroads, the key moment of change in this discussion is the moment when the population of the Bolivian city of Cochabamba told that their local water company had been sold to another well-known charitable institution by the name of Bechtel Corporation. You'll be familiar with them too, but not as a charitable corporation. Rose up, as is so often the case, not because they had done a profound study of the UN reports on water and had reached the conclusion that there was an issue here about water, but for the very much simpler reason that the price proposed by Bechtel for most people in the poor communities of Cochabamba, in the farming communities around, for the working class people in small factories of the town, would have made the difference between hunger and not hunger. The water price would have meant that they would no longer be able, they would have to choose essentially between food and water. That's why they rose up. In rage and in anger, confronted the Bolivian state for several weeks, confronted its repressive apparatus, but eventually won their battle, and the water was returned to the public sector and to committees of local control. That then echoed when 3 years later exactly the same thing happened in the city of El Alto, above La Paz in Bolivia, and the population again rose up. And this time it was a French company called Lyonnaise, and Aguas de Tunari, and they fought and successfully beat back in an attempt to privatize their water. But the point is that privatization of water was on the accepted agenda of neoliberalism. Now, it's worth considering what that actually means, and the examples are legion, but just to use a couple. In South Africa, the single largest water corporation in the world, which is Vivendi, they keep changing their name. I think the latest name is Veolia Environmental. God, they have no shame, these people. You know, first of all, we destroy the environment, and then we name ourselves after it as a kind of commemorative act. You know, so Vivendi was invited in to offer a contract for water in South Africa, and particularly to supply Soweto and some of the townships. They then announced that they would no longer be pursuing the contract because these people won't be able to pay for their water. People were too poor to pay the required price for their water. We now know that water is metered, but it's metered, and when people can't pay their bill, the water is cut off. So we're now in a situation where water has entered the commodity market. You know, it is one more commodity. And if we want an illustration for people of what capitalism is and its fundamental cruelties, its fundamentally brutal and anti-human nature, then just consider the fact that as the world population grows and water resources become scarcer, or the availability of water, the majority of the world population becomes scarcer, it then becomes increasingly attractive as a commodity. The very scarcity itself gives it a value in a capitalist system based on profit and accumulation. It's brutal, but it's illustrative in the most dramatic of ways, I think. So, and there are other examples of it. I mean, obviously, any discussion about water, I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but we need to talk a little bit about bottled water and all that implies. Now, I don't remember, I don't really remember going to pubs and having to decide between a martini, a cocktail, and a glass of water. In many cases, I'd probably have chosen the martini because it was cheaper than the water. But when did water become a luxury good? Because it did become a luxury good. I remember it, and I think the marketing of it was very, very significant. You see, on the one hand, water was life, it was everywhere, it was plentiful, nobody bothered much about it. As it grew more scarce, it became more interesting. Then it became bottled in nice green bottles, the so-called Perrier Revolution. I was always fascinated by one particular bottled water, which is called Vulcan. And apparently, the television ad was a guy in a leopard skin, well, an animal skin anyway, I'm not sure if it was a leopard, maybe a bear skin or something, leaping about on an empty mountaintop, and beside him a stream gurgling down the river, down the mountain. And at one point he stopped to drink it, and we were then told that this was Vulcan, really? What?
15.
Oh, okay. This was Vulcan, and it said water from volcanoes. So on the one hand, we were being offered water in plastic bottles, which, by the way, the half litre of water in the plastic bottle was as nothing to the 100 litres of water. Sorry, actually, the 200 litres of water required to make the plastic bottle, right? But water then, so we were in some sense subtly persuaded that water was not the basic stuff of life. Water was no longer a right, because water was a common property to all until it became profitable. And that's when it began to change. And that's when the politics of water became an issue for us all. The bottled water, incidentally, I don't want to worry any of you, but you may find it interesting that I think the number of bottles of water sold in the average year passes 100 billion. You know, so that's your two will make 99 billion. Well, anyway, never mind. The point is that the US and the Dutch governments did independent studies of the safety of the water. And you may be interested to know that the American Drugs and Drugs Administration discovered that 25% of bottled water had toxic substances and E. coli, and the Dutch government, there's no reason to trust them particularly, they found 40% of bottled water was contaminated. Now Richard's going to pick up a bottle and drink from it as an act of personal defiance. Okay, you got the 60%, but you can't be sure. Anyway, but that aside, so as it became commodity, so it became fought over. The wars for water were commercial wars. Who is without water? The poor. Who is with water? The rich. Water in Nigeria, for example, bottled water, and then there was the ultimate slap in the face when Coca-Cola produced a new brand of water. They're all produced, by the way, by Nestle, by Vivendi, by Coca-Cola, by Pepsi-Cola. Even if they say directly distilled from mountain streams, believe me, they're not. But they produced one water called Dasani, which was polluted. But this was polluted in the factory, the bottling factory, because actually, in Britain anyway, they withdrew it when they discovered that Dasani was directly taken from the water supply, the public water supply of Purley in Surrey, and Coca-Cola was just distilling it. So, anyway, but together with that, these firms, Pepsi-Cola, look on their website. Pepsi-Cola apparently is an environmentally conscious multinational enterprise, which it assures us on their webpage will return the water they take. And I'm fascinated to know how the hell they're going to return the water, but in fact they probably will. But they will return polluted water, contaminated water. They'll return the water they used to create the bottles. Where is the world's water now? The bulk of fresh water, let's just, a quick statistic, because these things can become very confusing, but 97% of the water on the planet is undrinkable. It's salt water. That leaves 3%. 2% is locked up in water, ice caps, and in rocks in underground aquifers, and that leaves 1% of the world's water. It is being consumed. But there is for us, a really dramatic issue here, which is that unlike oil, water is renewable, or at least it would be if it were controlled in some socially responsible way, if it were still a commons and a right. Now, the World Bank, you'll be interested to know, you may not have noticed when you drank that bottle, that what began as a right ended up as a need. That sounds innocent enough, doesn't it? Except that a right is what it says, a human right to which you have access as a consequence of your humanity. A need is something that can or may not be fulfilled according to the availability of your cash and their products. The World Bank redefined it so that privatization could then go ahead without it being condemned as an appropriation of common property and a public right. Now that's the situation we're in. The battle over water, Mark Twain, how he knew 150 years ago, I don't know. He said, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting over. Well, he was right. And there is a great battle for water, but it's a battle against not just the water corporations. This is something we've got to think through, because of the world's fresh water, 15% is used for human consumption one way or another. And the other 85% is used by agriculture and industry. And it's used to produce. Fred Peart, his book, When the Rivers Run Dry, is a very good book, but he says, he looks at individual consumption. He says, okay, we're not drinking that much water, but most of us probably drink, I don't know, maybe, 15, 20 litres, maybe 15 litres a day directly, but actually we're consuming a great deal more. We're consuming a great deal more because, for example, the production of a kilo of rice involves 5,000 litres of water. The production of a kilo of wheat involves 1,000. A kilo of potatoes, 500. A kilo of beef, 24,000 litres of water. That's on the one hand. Then we go to agricultural products. The products that are delivered to us by agriculture. Cotton, for example, is the thirstiest crop on the planet. It uses 3 times as much as any other product of export agriculture. Now, that could lead us to an argument about consumption, that we should consume less. I don't think that's the argument. I think it is an argument about whether a capitalist system, devoted as it is to profit and accumulation, is capable of looking at our common resources and addressing them in the long term as a common resource to be cared for, to be husbanded, to be properly organized. Is it? Well, the evidence before us is absolutely not. And water wars, of which there is a great deal of talk, water wars are, in a sense, we might imagine that they would be conflicts between states. Whereas somebody who's written a very good book about water said to me, water wars will not be wars between states. They will be the systematic deterioration of the conditions of life and people's attempt to hold off disaster. So we ask ourselves, well, where's the water going? If you look, for example, at most of the global south, the struggle at the moment, taking Latin America, for example, the struggle at the moment is a battle for land. To own land is to own water. And the land is being fought over in Colombia, in Brazil, in the Amazon, not in order to produce logically and rationally for the public good, to preserve and conserve and rationally use public resources, but rather a battle to use that land and use those resources to produce more commodities for an international market at the expense of humanity as a whole, and not to mention these individual regions. So in Peru, the struggles are over water, but not directly about water. In the new atmosphere of a rampant second phase of neoliberalism, large chunks of the Amazon region are being handed over to multinational oil corporations, mineral corporations, gas corporations. They use the water in such a way, they deforest in order to open mines, and when they deforest, the water, instead of going back down into the water table, flows directly into the rivers and is carried away and is largely polluted. So that's one problem with water. Or, for example, in Paraguay, one of the largest single aquifers in the world, in the Paraná, there is currently, very recently, one of those events that nobody notices. The overthrow of a president, a bishop called Lugo. President Lugo of Paraguay was overthrown in a quiet coup that nobody cared about very much. After all, where is Paraguay? Well, I'll tell you where Paraguay is. It's on top of one of the most significant aquifers in the whole of the American continent. You will be surprised to learn that the people who overthrew him are the organized landowners who have benefited and continue to benefit from export agriculture, producing mainly soya and maize for bioethanol, not for consumption, for bioethanol fuel. They removed President Lugo, they are now in power, and the water from the Paraná is planned to be channeled towards the city of Sao Paulo, and it will almost certainly be empty by 2040. So there is a battle going on, and it's a struggle which is, the visible one is about controlling water resources directly. The visible one is about Vivendi, Lyonnaise, Thames Water, the great multinational water corporations whose annual income exceeds $100 billion a year. But beyond that are the great export agricultural combines, the mining companies, the oil companies, who drill with no regard for tomorrow and for no regard with the commons. And our problem is that very often the people who are fighting a rearguard action against these invasions are people who look like and who are represented as fighting modernity, fighting the development of industry, fighting the creation of new modern agriculture, fighting the Green Revolution. Well, as we've spoken about many times in many sessions here, the struggles are conducted in many ways and for many different ostensible reasons, and from many starting points. But that struggle, whether people wear Indian garb and speak strange Andean languages or not, what they're fighting is capitalism red in tooth and claw. That is capitalism at its most brutal, and nothing could be more brutal than the appropriation of life itself to transform it into a commodity so that it can be bought and sold by great corporations who will transport goods across the world at enormous cost, but who will also enjoy the privileges of exporting their goods to Israel. Israel, for example, its wealth has meant that it can bring, this astonished me when I saw it, that, you know, the transport of water is a difficult problem. So unlike oil, it's difficult to transport. So in a sense, the corporations go to the areas and appropriate the land itself. But in some cases, they have found a ways of transporting it. You may, at some point during your Mediterranean holiday, raise your eyes to see passing you a tugboat pursued immediately by a 1 million litre polythene bag. You may not recognize it as a polythene bag, but that's what it is. That is almost certainly water being transported from Turkey, from the Ilyasu Dam, after the expulsion of several tens of thousands of families from the area. But it doesn't matter, they're Kurds, so it doesn't matter, they can be eliminated. And that water then is taken to Israel to sustain the Zionist state, which is also condemning the Palestinian people to endless thirst. Now that's the reality of the politics of water. And I suppose, since I haven't got much time, just to finish off and say, well, how should we respond to that? Now, there's one way of that is to talk about conservation. But really, conservation, flush your loo less, it's fine, flush your loo less. But that's not going to affect at all a world water industry, which is 90% or 85% of which is dominated by huge multinational corporations who will exhaust supplies of water. The aquifer, for example, the Himalayan watershed, has decreased by 40% in the last 20 years. Why? Because the water is being taken by China to feed what's called the Three Rivers Project. Okay, the new industrial developments of China are taking the water. The invasion of Tibet, I certainly don't remember anybody saying it had anything to do with water, but what I can tell you is that China's bottled water is called water from Tibet. It's taken from the Himalayan watershed. The rest of it is taken down through India and so on, where, for example, Coca-Cola has bought up large swathes of land to produce, to sink wells to produce Coca-Cola. And frankly, I don't believe they'll return any of it, except in the shape of those well-known bottles. So is there an alternative? Well, there certainly is. But there isn't an alternative which doesn't address directly capitalism itself. Because if anything illustrates how capitalism functions and what commodity actually means and how our common resources are taken from us, then water must be it. And there is an alternative. And in a sense, the argument about water is a little bit easier than the argument about oil. Because we talk about peak oil, the moment when the oil will run out or the gas will run out. Water will not run out. Water is a renewable resource if it is allowed to renew. If the aquifers are allowed to renew, if the rivers are not polluted, if the factories and dams designed to serve the interests of multinational corporations are stopped from spewing out their contaminants directly onto the water table, if the rivers, which used to run into the sea like the River Colorado and no longer runs into the sea, is allowed to run again. If the silt is taken, if the contaminated lakes above the great dams built as prestige projects and now polluting the water are blown up, moved, and the water's allowed to flow again. All of that is a possibility. And then we can think about, and we should think about, a new world water order. That is an order in which water is controlled democratically and from below, in which needs and requirements are assessed from the perspective of the rights of people and communities who need to have access to water, in which water is not wasted and abused in order to produce goods which are unnecessary. Yes, we might have to consider whether we really need the amount of water that is used to produce a packet of green beans from Kenya, which arrive in Tesco or in Safeways, and which contain an inordinate amount of water. I'm involved in trying to make a film about this at the moment, and I thought we should begin by going around a supermarket and having each thing represented by the amount of water, that it involved, and then just letting it go and seeing how much of the world got flooded as a result. I found out the other day that the Chinese character for politics means flood control, which I thought was very significant, and it tells us something very real. At the moment, there are over 1 billion people without access to fresh water. The way the world is going under a neoliberal regime, under an intense and intensifying globalization, means that we might have a conception of progress that will naturally bring water to most people. Actually, the reverse is almost certainly true. And although all the World Water Forums, if you see World Water Forums and World Water Congress and so on, look very carefully at the sponsors, because they're almost all sponsored by multinationals, right? But there's a man in Mexico called Professor Biswas, though he's really called that, who has exposed the lies that they tell and revealed what is really involved. So if we want to, it's a common resource, but a common resource can only be used for the common good in a very different kind of society and in a very different kind of world. And if, part of our unmasking of the realities of capitalism may be accelerated and may be easier when we show how brutal, how inhuman a system is, which takes the very stuff of life and turns it into a commodity to be bought and sold, and says to those who can't afford it, you shall have none of this. Of course, in that case, they will die. Or they will do what the women of Soweto and some of the other townships in South Africa do, which is walk the equivalent in a year of the distance between their homes and the moon in order to get their water and bring it back from the nearest available wells. Unless, of course, and they will continue to do so in the 21st century. I think we should begin by saying that our understanding of the politics of water is that this source that it is will once again be renewed. It's an environmental argument, but it's more profoundly than that, a political argument about the kind of world we want to build.
Yeah, you go ahead, sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thanks. Is it possible that energy, that water is in more jeopardy than energy in long term? Because when you look at fracking, which not only expands the availability of fossil fuels for the time being, and it also pollutes the water, and perhaps nuclear fusion might be discovered, and that would pollute water further. So, and also, is it possible that in the future water could be genetically modified such that it would be enhanced with vitamins or something, and gradually, or just to be less susceptible to pollution, such that the existing water that would not be a property of Monsanto or some corporation would gradually be phased out, or there's some machination would be created to phase the existing water out. So it is a... Thank you.
That gentleman there before.
Yeah, just to go back to Palestine, two little points of information which might interest you. The settlements, the Jewish settlements in the West Bank, use far much more water, per capita, per person, than the Palestinian villages below. I can't remember the statistics now, but you can find it out there. It's colossal, and if you drive around settlements, as I did back in 2008, you'll see green lawns, you'll see olive trees that have been hoisted from Palestinian gardens, and they're constantly being watered. One other fact, Palestinian farmers in the West Bank are not allowed to drill a well more than a metre below the soil, the ground, which is incredible. I mean, I remember meeting a farmer in a village outside Ramallah, and he's desperate, so desperate he had all these tanks up on his roof, so that when it did rain, he was trying to catch the water to feed both his family and his animals. So that's two other examples of how Israel is, if you like, is controlling the water that belongs to all the people in that region.
Our bill, when we came in, was a small bill. Now it's an astronomical for my dad. And overnight one day they decided not only do you pay for water, but you also pay for sewerage now. So what did they do? Did they install a meter to see how much water was coming out of your house? No, they just doubled your bill. Just overnight. They just put ×2. So when they start to bring in the water charges here, they say it's only a small fee, this, that. We need to do the research, get the precedents from other places where they brought these in, and exponential rate by which it goes up to line the pockets of these big multinational water and utility companies. And I think it's very important to recognize the practices and to be able to say this is what's going to come down the road.
Richard? Richard?
I just want to thank Mike and Glenda for completely putting me off my wasn't bottled water. I mean, I think it was a brilliant talk, and I mean, this is one of the key targets of the Troika, to use the crisis. It was one of the first things they insisted as part of the bailout, so-called bailout arrangement. Was for the government to give a commitment that it would privatise water, introduce water charges, and then once you charge for something, then it becomes subject to all the international rules of trade, and it has to be privatised essentially. So that's the agenda, and the Troika are very conscious of it. They want our forests, they want our water, they want our state enterprises. But the good thing is that they have tried twice to do this over the last 20 years, and they've been defeated on both occasions. I mean, we certainly need to learn a bit from Bolivia and so on, where things reached a very high level. We can also just learn from our own history of successful resistance that we can beat them, and have beaten them twice. And the fact that this was one of the first things that the Troika asked for, but it is one of the last things the government, it still hasn't done it, right? And it's afraid to do it. They're afraid to do it because they know they're going to, if they think the battle on household charges, €100 on household charges is going to be bad, or 400 or 500 on the property tax, wait till you see the water charges. Similarly in the north, they were afraid to do it in the north as soon as we began to mobilise. So we should take a little bit of confidence out of that, although their agenda is absolutely sinister and focused on this most important of all natural resources. They are not terribly confident here that they can get away with it. And really, we just have to marshal our forces for that battle, and take on the arguments. Obviously, all the stuff that's been mentioned about let's fix the pipes, not meter them, and so on. It's a very obvious argument. And I think the more successful we are, obviously, in battling on the property tax over the coming months, the more we will prepare people and create the momentum that will be necessary to defeat their effort to get water. Just one last point, and a sort of technical question really to Mike, and maybe I'm simplistic about this, and I don't understand the science of water, but I mean, can we ever really run out of water except by then creating an artificial shortage of it? Given that all you have to do is build reservoirs. I mean, that seems to me, maybe that's completely simplistic, that all you need to do is build reservoirs, unless it stops raining. But I mean, isn't there always going to be rain, and won't we always have the capacity to have enough water if we build a reservoir? I mean, part of the problem here actually is that they haven't built reservoirs. They haven't built any new reservoirs, I think, since the beginning of the century, and they haven't rehabilitated the water infrastructure, basic water infrastructure. But it is quite within our capacity to, it seems to me, to provide water on a renewable and adequate basis for everybody always, if we just collectively as a society build the infrastructure to do so.
Conscious of one thing. By the way, Mike, I enjoyed your talk. Genuine. Richard may be aware of one thing. I'm a Wicklow man, and we have a fucking massive reservoir there. And for years we were not campaigning, but we complained and whinged about the industries in Dublin that were taking all the water. We'd sold our rights, blah blah blah. But I was just thinking about what Richard said, because industry, at the times that you don't have rain, and believe it or not, we do have times like that, we don't have a lot of rain in this country, industry drains the reservoir, and we did have in Wicklow several occasions where the levels went down. But that's not a here nor there. I don't think that the rain alone would suffice, even though we're in a very water-rich country. But what I will say is this. I was in a meeting just before this, and we were talking about the media and how the media corrupts everything that we're told, you know. And one of the things that came up was in terms of money, the argument that when we put it up, that, you know, the working class people's money, you know, and you would have heard this, Richard, you know, and the point was being made by Vincent that it's our money, it's all of us, it's all our money, it's the state's money. This fucking water is ours. It's ours. You made the point yourself. And it's very much akin to everything else that we're fighting here, which is revolution. We have to have a revolution. It's as blatant as every one of us in this room today, because everything is linked up. The water, our health, our education, it's everything, you know. The fact that you came over is fantastic, Mike, just to give us a breakdown of the actual statistics of it. But, you know, the reality of it is the machine that we're fighting, this capitalist machine we're fighting, let's never underestimate the evil of it. To actually think that, you know, we come in with some argument about something that we're going to fight, and we have a list of them, God knows, in this country, right across the world. But the powers that be in the background, the evil capitalist forces that are there, are already, as we sit here, implementing plans that are much further advanced than we even think our arguments are. So I would say that we actually have to prepare for the real fight. And I mean a stand-up fight on all levels. So I would ask anybody that leaves the room to commit themselves to that fight. That's what we're about. Thanks.
You know, we need investment. But I don't think poor investment for the last 20 years is an excuse for us, you know, to privatise the one essential right that we have, right for water, or one of the rights we should have, should I say. In Ireland, the water system works at 97% capacity. So if there's any kind of drain on it, so we saw a few years ago when there was the kind of leakages due to the bad weather, it went into crisis form very, very quickly. In other countries, that capacity is only at something between 50 to 70% in France and other European countries. So we actually are chronically underfunded. I think, Richard made the point that, we haven't built reservoirs over the last number of years. So I think it's really important that we go and demand that, we actually improve the infrastructure about water, and then the whole thing about leakages as well. So that's my first point. The other point is, I just think we need to be really careful on, and I'm sure people will take issue with me, on the fluoridation issue. That was a public health policy made decades ago. It wasn't anything to do with bottled water, and it was because of dental problems that were within mostly working class communities. So we just, it was before the invention of bottled water. And there's fortification of lots of products. All your margarine since World War II is fortified with vitamin D. So there's lots of fortification of food that happens. And there has been studies which look at cities, and the two cities that are usually compared are Dublin and Glasgow, two kind of working class cities, and we don't find the results which says that cancers are erased and all of those things. So we do need to be a little bit careful that we don't sound a bit kind of, I don't know, out there when we start making arguments about water.
Thanks very much. I just want to make a few housekeeping things just before I let